All right. Hello and good morning, everybody. This is Ashley with Intermark Group. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. Our webinar topic is on making calculated marketing bets for 2021. Specifically, how should you think about 2021 creating your marketing plan for 2021? How has your market, how have your customer segments changed during this year? And are there new psychological drivers influencing your customer purchase decisions? We'll cover these questions and more and offer strategies for success. Our two webinar speakers today from Intermark are Jake McKenzie and Dr. David Bridwell. Jake McKenzie is the CEO of Intermark and considered a national expert on psychology-driven marketing. He has a background in psychology and has helped shape successful brands like Toyota, Krispy Kreme, Progressive Insurance, and more. He loves the outdoors. He's an avid reader and a father to four. Dr. David Bridwell is a people scientist at Intermark by day and folk musician by night, who is interested in understanding how people are influenced and how they make decisions. At Intermark, he helps ensure our creative is informed by behavior science and uses applied psychology to help brands build deeper psychological connections with their customers. Before we kick things off, please make note of a few house rules. There are really no rules, really, with the exception that we'd love to hear from you during and after the webinar. So please share your comments and questions with us in the Zoom chat function at the bottom of your screen. We'll try and answer all questions at the end, and if we don't, we're happy to connect with you after. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jake and David.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Welcome back, everybody. I can't believe we are in the middle of fourth quarter of 2020. This has been the last 2 weeks have been the longest 8 months of my life, as the saying goes. Lots of change. Today, we're going to talk about something a little different. Instead of talking about current trends in webinars, we're going to answer the question I get most frequently in the last 60 days, and that's how do we plan for 2021? You know, 20 is already kind of in the bag, if you will, for marketing purposes. So we're shifting our attention ahead. And how do we adapt in this new world where there's so much changing, so much unknown, whether it's capturing and keeping growth that we have had or recapturing markets or taking advantage of changes in human behaviors, lots of questions. So we thought what we would do today is walk you through our process for doing that. So as always, we'll start with a little bit about ourselves. Intermark is the nation's largest psychology-driven marketing firm. When I say psychology, I really mean the behavioral sciences, psychology, sociology, behavioral economics. And we have been blessed to do that for a lot of the nation's largest and best and most fun clients. And what they all have in common is taking these principles and applying them in a space to drive measurable outcomes that exceed what they would have been able to get otherwise. Now, we do all of those things, but it covers the spectrum of everything under the marketing sun. As our team likes to say, we do everything from ads to apps. So from TV spots and digital display and search all the way to mobile apps and better websites, et cetera, in 3 offices around the country, Birmingham being the headquarters, and Atlanta and Tampa as well. And so lots of fun stuff. But enough about us. Let's get to the topic at hand. What do we do about 2021? So much has changed. And a lot of people think that, well, 2020 is going in the rearview mirror. We can go back to normal. That's the phrase that we're all desperate to hear, right? That we're back to normal, right, David? But unfortunately, it's not back to normal, at least not in 2021. Part of the reason is that a lot of the behavior change that we saw in 2020 that we have been talking about all year long, it's not going anywhere. In fact, we've been doing this long enough, it's no longer temporary. Once you've been doing those behaviors for the last 7, 8 months, depending on when you went into your first quarantine, those are now just your behaviors. Thus, the marketing plans that we have to adapt. So then we take a step back and look at the big picture. What we see is there's no dusting off last year's marketing plan and updating it like we did for the last 10 years in some places. We've truly got to revisit a lot of those fundamental assumptions, not just about your product, but about your audience and your entire category, and take advantage of some of the trends that have shifted. So you start with the basics of what is going on, what's happening out there, what are the trends that are happening in the world, what's happening with my competitors, and what behavior changes have occurred. Now, this is often the step that gets omitted because people put in a marketing plan, a marketing strategy, and they often executed on it for up to a decade. Can't do that this time around because there's been so much change. So we're going to start with that, give you a few highlights for that. We also want to give you a larger framework for walking through the entire process.
Yeah, you know, this is a good time to take a step back. A lot of times what happens as companies is they get in a rhythm, and they're pushing their products and focusing on all the little things that pop up every single day, and they don't take a step back and think, okay, what are the assumptions that we have behind our brand, our product, and category? Those big picture questions like, has our customer base changed? Is our market any different? Does our product have new competitors? So now is a great time to ask those questions and say, let's build a strong foundation. There has been a sort of a kind of reset or take a step back approach that can build a strong foundation going forward.
Yeah, and if you know me, you know I'm an eternal optimist. And so I view great periods of change as opportunity. Because anytime there's change, there's going to be opportunity. And if you view it like that, then it'll give you an opportunity to take advantage of it. It starts with an understanding of what our consumers are thinking, that human psychology of what we're all going through. You know, we're all looking for that sense of normalcy. We're all looking for the ways that things have changed and we can take advantage of them both as consumers. But I hope you're thinking about that as a marketer as well.
Yeah, the important thing is that all of marketing is about human behavior. At the end of the day, every goal that we can write down in a marketing goal, it comes down to affecting human behavior and human perception, whether it's buying more of your product, having people who are already buying it, buying more, people who've never heard of it, hearing about it, people realizing a need maybe they didn't know about, or being aware of your product for the first time. It's all perception and awareness and behavior. And so understanding of human psychology is fundamental to marketing in general. So particularly the attitudes, motivations, and behaviors that underlie the people that are interested in your product category. And that's what one of the things that we'll be diving into here.
And you're here because you're interested in marketing strategy, obviously. And no, you're not alone. As we have surveyed CMOs over the years, one thing that is interesting in 2020 is brand strategy has popped to the top of the list as CMOs believing that it is the most important skill to have. And it is because of all the change that's going on. And that's notable because in prior surveys, it was never near the top of the list, at least for the last several years. It's always been very low funnel activities like digital marketing and analytics and things that make us smarter about our marketing. And there's a realization that we've got to rethink what we are doing and really lean into brand and answer that question, why you? So enough of the hype. Let's get into what we need to be focusing on. We're going to walk through a 4-step process that we like to put all of our clients through. Step 1 is reevaluating our market. And in that, we're going to take a look at trends that are ongoing, what our competitors are doing, et cetera. Then we're going to take that and apply it against ourselves. We're going to set some goals and map the psychological drivers that we think we can take advantage of with our audience. And that implies that we understand what's going on with our consumers. Against that, we're going to identify some segments within our target set that we believe that can help us achieve our goals, whether that's retention, growth, conquest, what have you. And then lastly, do we get to the execution phase, the creative, and finding ways to differentiate ourselves, our messaging. Now, it's important to note that is dead last. You don't start with, hey, I've got a good idea for a marketing campaign. I hear that all the time. I get emails and phone calls. My mom will say, hey, I got an idea for an ad. But if you don't go through the rest of the process, you'll end up with something that sounds like a good idea, but doesn't help you achieve your goals. So let's start with step 1, reevaluating your market. And that truly is going to mean in 2021, starting with a blank sheet of paper. It's going to look very different than what we did in 2020. Duh, there's hopefully less or at least mitigated COVID, crossing our fingers for that one. But it also means that all the planning that we did for 2020 and coming into it, that's not going to be the same either because lots of things are different. That kind of goes without saying, right, David?
Yeah. And, the other thing is we often look at the previous year to kind of dictate our approach to the next year. And so, do you really want to do that? You need to ask yourself that. Does that make a lot of sense? Or do you want to take a fresh look? That'll be a big thing to think about.
And I think we can safely say that 2020 was a year of massive change.
There's a lot happening. So you want to set your map. That's what it means to reevaluate your market, is you got your map in place, and from there you can build your strategy. And like Jake just alluded to, this is a quote that kind of captures it. There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. Now, this is just a standard kind of way that culture and society progresses. So it's not uncommon to find that there's periods of rapid change and then periods of less rapid change, periods of stability. But you can imagine that we're in a period now where there's a lot of change that's happening.
And I want to pause before you even get into this slide and appreciate the fact that you chose linen to preface what is undoubtedly a very capitalist presentation that ensues. Well done to bring the world together like that, David.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, but to me, that points out how universal it is,
That
right?
is absolutely true. There's some truths in there.
Yeah.
But change is happening and accelerating.
Yeah, really think about the pre-existing trends, right? This is not the emergence of things that we've never heard of before, telehealth, telemedicine, and so on. These things have been trending upwards for a while, and now it's really about an acceleration of these trends. So a lot of the things that we've already been talking about. If you look at percent of e-commerce sales, for example, in the past decade, here we are rolling along 2010, each quarter, 2011, incrementally up from 5% up to 7.5, 10% of e-commerce sales here to the end of the decade. And then we reach the last quarter in 2020 with a big spike. That's about 5 years of an increase in percent of e-commerce sales that happened within a short period of time.
And I think this is a really great encapsulation. Very few of the major trends that we saw were truly new. They're just dramatic accelerations when they feel like something new. And it's important to note that that spike isn't going back down. It's going to continue. Maybe not at the same rate of growth that we saw in 2020, but it means that our baseline assumptions are now off if we're still using the assumptions that we came into this year with. And it's not just e-com. It is just about everything. It's how people buy groceries, how they visit their doctors, how they pick their food up from restaurants now instead of going in, even how we are selecting those restaurants based off of different criteria. So if you were selling anything from insurance to potato chips, revisit your assumptions, because chances are there's a macro trend occurring that's going to change those assumptions.
Yeah, you want to be aware of those trends that are happening and think about, as you go to define your market, thinking about that they're operating within this sort of slightly different landscape. And that's the first step here. We want to focus now on identifying and acknowledging that defining the market is the very first step. And it's actually a really important question. We distill it into a single sentence often, and that's super important. It needs to be questioned and it needs to be well thought out. There's one approach, there's extremes, right? So the Bruce McCall, the Mars CMO, famously said that his market was all 7 billion people that exist on the earth, right? That's a really large market. Typically, you won't be doing that. Even Apple themselves doesn't define the entire world as their market. For example, they don't have broad coverage in China. They decide to focus on other countries more than others. And so we have to make these tactical decisions about focusing on sometimes very specific markets. If you have a medical device, for example, your market might be doctors. But maybe the particulars of the device means that your market is actually primary care doctors. Or maybe even more honing in because of your product, your market is actually urban primary care doctors. But you've made that decision, it's been informed by your product, and now that you have that key piece of information, you can move forward with strong strategy.
Now, as you go through this process, we encourage you to think about how you do it, and specifically the people that get to weigh in on this. Because often we envision the CMO sitting in a room and saying, well, hey, what's going on? What are the trends and how do I build upon that? And they come up with things that sometimes seem obvious. For instance, if you grew a lot this past year, maybe you're in the consumer packaged goods space, it might be about retention. And retention's a fairly easy road. There are few obstacles because psychologically getting people to do the same thing they've been doing is a fairly straightforward process. And thus you might envision it like a road. Or you may decide we need some conquest. We didn't grow enough. I'm going to have to grow in 2021. Otherwise, my CEO is going to be upset. So we got to do some expansion. We got to get people to do business with us that weren't doing it before, in which case, psychologically, it's going to be a little more difficult. More to use the metaphor of like a jungle. There are things in our way. We're going to have to clear them out. We're going to have to change behavior. You can still do it, but the resources required and the tactics required are very different. And as you go through your goal setting process, I encourage you to be very specific. You know, we want to increase retention by X amount with this segment. We want to conquest this audience and increase it by X percentage. Because the more specific you are, the more you can inform not just your communication strategies, but your messaging strategies, like where we talk to people. And even those have changed.
Yeah, and we really want to acknowledge that there's a broad variety, as Jake alluded to. There's very specific goals that you can have, like getting your most frequent purchasers to buy even more, or getting your less frequent purchasers to buy slightly more than they typically do. And really, we need to appreciate that actually human behavior is actually a strong component to these goals that we have. Because when we think about retention, it's something that is a habit that's been well formed, and habits and memory form the majority of decisions and perceptions that we make throughout the day. So getting somebody to purchase a product that they previously purchased before is a lot easier than getting somebody who doesn't know about the product. Maybe they don't know about the category. Maybe they don't even know about the need that supposedly you're supposed to be filling. That's a huge hurdle to jump with the customer. And so that's an important component. And often that's why one of the most common goals is to focus on buying from me instead of my competitors, right? Because you've got a large market space, a large market share, and they're already going out there. They understand the need in the product. Now, instead of choosing that one, they just choose that one. Simple behavioral switch.
Pulling people into a category is much more challenging psychological than simply conquering within a category as somebody's already intending to buy. Now you may be asking, how do I do that? How do I come to these conclusions? And I encourage you to think very broadly, to get multiple folks in the room. An example of the need for that is the way technology has changed. Our own media director, Jim Poe, often is at the table for these strategy discussions because of the way we can now target people in ways that we couldn't even 5 years ago, allows us to have different and more evolved marketing strategies. An example, in the mascara space, one might say, hey, we need to talk to everybody in the US because they're a potential buyer influencer. And if we do that, we find there's a lot of waste in that plan. 60% of people are never going to buy mascara. Or we might target it down to the core audience that buys mascara. And this is the most common strategy for the last decade or so. And in that, people target mascara users of that age. But even still, we have 27% of people who don't wear mascara in that space. And as a result, are going to be waste. But now with new technologies, we can target just mascara users so that we are only talking to people within the category. Thus, we have a lot less waste. Or we could drill it down even further and say, I only want to talk to, say, Maybelline mascara users. Technologies allowed us to have much more refined and evolved marketing strategies than we even could have a few years ago. Thus, the conclusion here is obviously revisit your marketing strategy. And number two, broaden the set of folks that you include in those early discussions. Do not treat folks like media as just the last step of the execution process where you hand them a TV spot and go, hey, go put this in front of some eyeballs. You put them in the strategy discussion at the beginning, you'll get much better outcomes.
Yeah, and I want to take a moment to appreciate the sort of different perspective that's happening here. If you think about the women aged 18 to 49, the approach that you've got going on is you're saying, let's look at my existing customer, let's find the most frequent demographics, and then define my market based on the most frequent demographics of my existing customer. And this is why I'm pushing the idea of defining your market, because that actually takes a market and makes it smaller. If you define your market as mascara users, which is possible in media, you're painting a broad circle that encompasses a much larger segment that might not even include current users of your product, but it does include current users of your category.
That's right.
Guys, can I just say everybody looks better with mascara? So it should be the whole market.
Yeah, there you go.
So everybody should consider mascara. Absolutely.
That's the lesson from today. Probably a good one. Number two, mapping psychological drivers. So you've set your goals. We start evaluating where that growth or retention or other goal is going to apply to. We got to be more specific. Now we talk about this in terms of mapping psychological drivers, but it begins with a process that you are certainly very familiar with, and that is segmentation.
Yeah, the reason we do segmentation is because we need to acknowledge that not everybody in your market is the same set of people. There are going to be different groups within there. And so you need to understand and appreciate the different psychology, attitudes, and behavior of those different groups. Particularly, you might have some people who are very extreme in one behavior and then others who are at the opposite extreme. And when you look at the whole pie and you average across them, you don't even capture that unique behavior at all, or that unique psychology, or that unique attitude at all, because you averaged them.
And we could talk about segmentation literally for the rest of the day. Instead, we're just going to hit some highlights here and make sure we get across some lessons that we focus on. The first is that segmentation can be challenging because rarely are you dealing with your own data set where you can do your own version of segmentation. We're either dealing with like a national survey we got or a third party piece of research. And what that does is it homogenizes the nation to give us back pooled data. And sometimes we find that those averages can be wrong, either because it makes us feel like when you homogenize the US, everybody talks like they live in Ohio, which obviously isn't the case, but averages can go wrong in lots of other ways. And it's important to think about how we do it. David came up with a really great example.
Yeah, and be sure to let us know in the Q&A any questions that pop up around segmentation or any other categories. We love diving into that. But yeah, I was thinking, I came up with this example. Imagine that you're a hoodie company and you want to think about the different segments who are purchasing hoodies. Well, one of them would be the cool high school hoodie wearer. This is the cool looking dude, he's in high school. But guess what? There's actually some pretty hip CEOs who are wearing hoodies too. So you got to acknowledge another hip CEO hoodie segment that exists. And I think Jake might even have a few hoodies in his closet.
I would have worn one today, but ain't nobody going to believe I'm hip anymore, man.
Now, what happens when you take the average of these two groups and you don't acknowledge that you're separate? You get something that looks like this: some middle-aged dude trying to be cool, a bunch of young people.
I can hear Steve Buscemi in my head saying, "Hello, fellow youths."
Yeah, so that's a failure. That's an average failing pretty bad right there.
But there are a lot of lessons to be learned in this. The biggest of which is you need to not just understand the demographics of your segmentation, but really the psychology of that group. And it may be the biggest lesson out of segmentation. We have a tendency to say, oh, we want to talk to women aged 18 to 35. Great. Not realizing that there's lots of different drivers within those segments, and they may be similar, but they have separate psychological drivers. And understanding the commonalities is what really makes segmentation powerful. It's not the demographics, it's the psychographics, and those vary across segments. This cannot be emphasized enough, otherwise you're going to sound tone deaf at times.
Yeah, and it can get pretty complicated. Now, this is an example that we like talking about in terms of how attitudes and behavior shape different customer segments, especially in different markets. So thinking about the mascara market here, often we think of customers as being more highly loyal. So if you're purchasing a particular product of mascara, then you probably are loyal to that product and you keep purchasing that one without going to competitive brands. Jake loves to talk about all of the low loyalty in the fast food area.
Well, I love to talk about this because the industry talks about it as low loyalty, but in really it's not that. It's just high frequency, and people have burnout. They can't eat at Burger King every day. And the core best user within this space will eat at 7 to 15 fast food locations in a week. Thus, they've got to have high frequency. So a different strategy in this space might be to increase your frequency where you show up in the rotation merely one extra time. You go from 2 times a month to 3 times a month. And just increasing that level can have dramatic effects on your long-term growth. Thus, reevaluating your segments and knowing what your opportunities are within those segments can drive different selection outcomes. And that's a big part of the reason we want to have diverse voices in that room when we're setting marketing strategy. Because when you understand what the parameters are possible, it's easier to tackle them. Now, segmentation, big bucket. I'm sure you're going to have some questions at the end and we'll come back to it. But as we've established our segments, we've got to go through, which is perhaps the next hardest thing that we'll do. And that's establish the important segments, the ones that we want to prioritize and how to communicate to those segments. So we know what our strategy is. We know what our goals are. We know what our segmentation looks like. Now we've got to identify where that growth is going to come from, where that retention is going to come from, and what it looks like.
Yeah, and this is where all your planning, you created that map and that psych profile of your customer. Now you meet the reality where you're handing off your information to the media team and so on. And they're like, okay, let's look at their spending potential. Let's take a look, is it cost effective to reach them? And can you even reach them, right? This is a key circle that completes the circle of strategy that is the sort of communicative teamwork effort that is needed for a really effective approach. And we can think of this as two different extremes, just for an example. So let's take one extreme. Imagine that you're going to focus on one priority segment. Now, this is a segmentation from Bands in Town. And what they did is they had data on people who go to concerts, and they determined that there were different groupings of people who went to concerts for different reasons. Now, in this example, let's say that you're going to focus on the super fans and you're going to pour all of your media dollars into that priority segment. So that the media dollars is that glass of water that's full. An alternative approach would be to reach all of the segments in the market with messaging that resonates with all of the segments in the market. So now you're distributing your media attention and dollars across these different glasses of water. There's less water in each glass, but overall, there could be more water overall. And that's just part of the strategic decision that you're making among the sort of two extremes that we're portraying here.
And I got to tell you, man, this one's difficult, particularly as you begin going through this exercise early, because the temptation is to take your bucket of money, whatever it is, and I know it's insufficient. No one's ever has enough marketing dollars, and you don't want to leave anybody out. So you start throwing tiny amounts at little audiences. But when you think about it strategically and you've established your goals and you've done your segmentation, you can come to the realization like that money cannot achieve enough in this tiny segment than if I piled it in. Thus, rarely is it one extreme or the other. Rarely do we only talk to one segment, or do we talk to all segments a little bit with segmented messaging, but it's usually somewhere in the middle because these segments often bleed over from one to another. And that's important because it affects the effectiveness of our marketing. And we are lucky in that this is a very well-studied area. What makes marketing effective?
Yeah, I love this study by Mark Ritson, 5,900 Effie Awards. And thinking about the strategic choices of focusing on the different segment groups, really you need to think about it in the context of number 6 and number 7 here. The 6 and 7 biggest contributors to advertising effectiveness is if your goal is brand awareness or mental availability, then you might want to push more towards reaching a broader segment of the population. You might think about a particular media channel that is more effective for that goal. Short term, that's the long. The short is short-term activation, more sales focused. In that case, it might be more targeted group with a more targeted message. And again, that is a media choice that might be different based on that goal. But combining them, that's an important thing, is to have both of them.
And it is. And the rookie CMOs always fall into the trap of that short-term return. What is the lowest funnel thing that I can measure, that I can show an outcome on? And what ends up happening is that you're squeezing the juice at the bottom of the funnel and you're able to show juice, but you're not putting any more fruit in the top of the bucket. And what happens is one day you look up and there's no more juice coming through because you haven't been feeding the machine. You haven't been working on brand building and long-term growth. You've just been focused on the near-term growth. And you usually only find that out as you are being shown the door as a CMO because it requires a balance of both. And even though that's hard to do in the near-term perspective, you've got to do it for the health of the organization for long-term growth.
Yeah, you don't want to run out of juice.
Yeah, particularly in today's world when we're all getting that juice delivered.
Try to get that juice flowing, folks.
That's right.
That's the number 2 message of the webinar today. Number 1, it's okay for everybody to wear mascara if you want to wear mascara. Number 2, keep that juice flowing.
We're going to expect to see some mascara in the next webinar, David.
All right, man. Well, you never know how things are going to go.
Hashtag 2020. So back to the marketing strategy. As we establish this mix, that's when you begin mapping types of mediums against that strategy. And you may think, okay, we always do TV or we only do digital. And chances are it's a balancing of those things. So each medium has a different function and they can vary within that function. As an example, you might be using video for awareness because people process video 60,000 times faster than we do print. So it can have a much longer term effect on our brains and is great for brand building. But you may need that balance of near-term marketing. So you put lower funnel activities like digital in the online space, whether it's search, display, website, even some types of social media that might fall on this. And you may need things that are a blend of the two where you capture people in different areas, such as outdoor or print ads or other forms of display marketing. And understanding your goals and your segments and where that growth is going to come from then begins to inform the types of marketing that we want to put in the marketplace. this. And only now do we begin to look at kind of the traditional marketing outcomes, and we start with the communications plan. Notice we are not starting with what's my TV spot, but rather how am I going to communicate with those folks? Because that must be the first question. And when you ask that as the first question, sometimes you come up with different answers, such as, you know what, we really need a big PR idea in this space, or we need a big social media idea in this space, or I need to build a community before I do anything.
That's a great point. And I think one of the additional pieces here is that often, and in the previous slide, I think it was number 7, multi-channel mix. Here you see a multi-channel mix. You've got 3 different mediums. That increases advertising effectiveness. So putting 100% in one channel is often not as effective of taking, say, 20% off that and allocating it to another channel, assuming that you have enough budget to do that.
But budget is always the big variable that we have hanging over our heads, right? And it drives a lot of these decisions.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to think about. So I just want to remind ourselves, we talked about the 2 different extremes. First is to reach all segments with messaging that resonates across the segments, using this bands in town segmentation as an example. The second extreme is to focus on a priority segment. Now here, looking at this example, you'll say, okay, the super fans there, look at the average spend per ticket, $85 per ticket. That's substantially more than the other folks, the other segments here are spending per ticket. And they're also, let's look at the percent of population, they're also a comparable percentage of the population. So it's reasonable if you have limited resources and you want to focus on that priority, this is a reasonable one to focus on.
That's right. Well, let's breathe some life into some of these and talk about how, as we identify segments, the implications that can have for everything else that we do and how you turn that into creative and media strategy. An example that we'll show is something we did in the gardening space. Now, in the gardening space, most gardening companies are targeting the folks with a green thumb, the high users, the people that are in on a regular basis that consider themselves good at this. And what that means is there's a huge segment out there that's neglected, and that's the everybody else. And specifically, it's the people who don't think that they're good at gardening, but would like to have plants around. And when we think about the size of those segments, one is tiny, although they spend quite a bit, and the other is massive. And the massive neglected segment we viewed as an opportunity, which allowed us to make better use of our marketing dollars. Rather than having an environment where we had competing messages, we wanted to talk to people that rarely get spoken to, and we understood their psychology, which is frustration at not being good at this. Creative flowed naturally.
Prove it. What? They were gonna die anyway.
And this was a wildly successful campaign, talking to a neglected segment, powerful psychologically, and a great example of how you started with strategy, found your segment, and then talked to that audience using powerful psychological marketing. Another great example of this is in the healthcare space. Now, hospital systems are all selling the same basic stuff. Come to our hospital system for all of your medical needs, right? And so the challenge is everybody wants to sell everything. And so as a result, they show pictures of doctors and things like that. With one of the health systems that we had the opportunity to work with, one of Ascension Systems, we decided to have them focus on a key segment, the maternity segment. Now, we realized maternity was the first time most people take an active choice in selecting a healthcare system. Thus, it was a point of entry and an emotionally powerful area, an opportunity for us to connect with people, to be the place where babies come from.
Where do babies come from? It's complicated. My brother said I came from the zoo, but he just made that up. They got me from the shopping channel. Get out of here. The mailman brings the babies. One word? Osmosis. That's a big word for a little baby. They come from cyberspace, but it takes a whole lot of gigs. What's a gig? Hey, one question at a time. St. Vincent's, where babies come from. Ugh, my brain hurts.
It's hard not to love little kids in TV spots. But what's remarkable about this was an investment in a long-term strategy and the outcomes. At the time we started this, St. Vincent's was number 6 out of 6 hospital systems in a region. Within 5 years, they were number 1 in the region overall. But here's the kicker. They became number 1 in every other subcategory of that hospital systems, including things unrelated from maternity, like cardio and cancer treatments because of the spillover effect. And it's a great example of segmentation informing a long-term strategy to drive growth. So another fun example is in the refreshment category or drinks. So we were working with a large tea manufacturer and they wanted to find a new segment. And we identified a group that was relatively untapped in this space. We wanted to bring them into the categories, people who like to work out on a regular basis. And we found that studying them, they had a ritual. After every workout, they would have a refreshing beverage. Sometimes those beverages were sodas, sometimes diet sodas, sometimes not. And a lot of times they were just coffee drinks and sometimes very high calorie coffee drinks. So as we understood this neglected segment and the behavior behind them, they became relatively easy to communicate with. Introducing our product, iced tea, to that category allowed us to have ads like this one. We talk about some of the reasons that you'd prefer iced tea being a natural drink as opposed to some of the preservatives and say sodas. We could also target against the coffee segment and remind them that this is much better for you on a lot of levels than that high calorie frappe, and not to mention all the fat packed into it. So it was a neglected segment and one that often didn't show up because it wasn't one of the huge segments. With a tiny little bit of effort, they were able to make big inroads in this segment and make iced tea a drink of preference for a post-workout regimen. Great example of segmentation, finding hidden gems to grow market share as opposed to fighting against the large competitors of everybody trying to get the same target market to do something slightly different.
Yeah, and this is some work that we did for Alabama tourism, thinking about the travel market. Now, first, we talked about the importance of defining your market. Here, we're focusing on moms who often make destination travel decisions and recognizing that there's actually a lot of variation in the decisions that they're making and what they're seeking when they're looking to travel. So here we have these different segments that acknowledge different attitudes, psychology, and behavior. And we decided to focus on some priority segments here in the examples that we include. And that what we chose was looking at spring break Gina. Here she's going out to spring break with her kids. Got foodie Gina here, she wants to go out and explore the great food opportunities that are around. And here you could see the media, the messaging that was catered towards spring break Gina, right? So you've got the Gulf Shores, the Gulf Coast there, it's print ads, it's video, it's digital on your phone, designed for all these different things, specifically with the messaging around here's a great spring break trip that you could do while the kids are out of school and so on. And of course, we make sure to reach them when they're going to make those crucial spring break decisions. And we're going to reach them in the areas where they can choose to go towards Alabama for their spring break. Here's the Foodie Gina case. The creative messaging this time is centered around food. And we've got a broad array of channels that we're focusing on, but we're highlighting all the great food opportunities that you could have by exploring around the state.
Before we get into this last piece of creative, 2 things to note. One, yes, there is overlap in these segments. These are not completely isolated segments. So sometimes you're talking to the same audience, you're just talking to their different drivers of motivation with different imagery at different places in time. The second is, and we don't spend a lot of time talking about this today because it's a huge topic, is the concept of trigger points, putting the right message in front of somebody at the right time. And that helps you balance that near-term and long-term marketing, the brand building, the creating preference with near-term activity. I'm ready to buy. How do I go ahead and do something about this? And so that right time, right place, and understanding the psychological drivers matters a lot. But the thing that most resonates is powerful creative things that are entertaining, that people want to consume, that will shape beliefs and behaviors. And your team did a great job with this one, David. This next spot, targeting the food Gina's, building Alabama up as an awesome food destination.
And now, what you've all been waiting for, the Alabama Food Eating Contest, right here. Are we ready? Drum roll, please. 3, 2, 1, eat. Oh, man. We don't have all day here.
Gotta stop and savor.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite commercials. Great. A way to appreciate the great food here is to say, hey, look, if you're in a food eating contest, you're going to have a difficult time because you want to savor that food.
You know, I'd love another time where we could sit and talk about all the little psychological cues you put into the spot. I think people would get a lot of them, but it's really important stuff. But
And that's actually a distinction. Sorry to interrupt, but the psychological cues is being distinct. And that's acknowledging that you have imagery that's consistent with your brand that you can spread throughout the piece, that when people see it, they recognize, oh, this is Alabama tourism, but you're not being literal with the logo. And probably we'll dive into that a lot more in how important that is in future webinars.
Great segue. Let's talk about the stage that we've gotten to, which is that messaging and creative, how we can take these segments, these goals, this psychological triggers that we've talked about, and then be distinctive and differentiate. And really, there are a lot of layers within this. I want to start by reminding you that this is the second most powerful driver of effectiveness in advertising, is how creative you are in your messaging. And that means break the cliches, quit looking and sounding like all of your competitors, because the brain filters that out and frankly, it ignores the bulk of it. So being different is lesson number one. And if you're not different, well, we toss it out the window. So we got to understand what people are thinking, then map it against what we want them to think, and then stitch together the difference. When you do that, your creativity, the messaging that we come up with, flows much easier. And it begins with answering the simple question, who are you? Why should I do business with you? Why you? Which is the fundamental question of what a brand means. If you heard me talk, you probably heard me use this example before. What's does Volvo stand for? And if I ask you that, I can hear you behind your computer screen mumbling safety, and specifically safety related to kids. They target new parents just as they're buying that new vehicle, which is a great trigger point for wanting a new vehicle, and talk to them about this is safe for your kids. They've been doing this for nothing short of 50 years, and everybody comes to that same conclusion. Everybody references Volvo as safety. Now, if you are a competitor to Volvo, you may be thinking to yourself, but wait a minute, we consistently beat Volvo on safety scores. I'm going to take that away. I want those parents to buy from me. Thus, we're going to go out into the marketplace and be the safety car brand. And you find yourself with a tree across the road. And that tree is safety. Somebody has already taken this road. You cannot drive on it. Now, you may be wondering, Jake, what are you talking about? Well, about a decade ago, our friends up at Nissan decided they were going to be the safety car brand. They made this big announcement. They spent just over $1 billion trying to convince America that they were the car brand that represented safety. This is likely news to you because it convinced none of us, because our brain takes that and filters it out and goes, no, it's not. I already know the safety car brand, that's Volvo. And it's because of how we process information. If we think we know something, if somebody has already claimed a space, well, we're not going to capture it. It's not that true that we can't capture it. It's just that it's going to be so expensive and so laborious, you don't want to spend your effort trying to accomplish that thing. But it's not as simple as going, oh, I can't use the word safety because they own it. But rather, there's a whole mental space we've got to be aware of. Right, David?
Yeah, this is, again, acknowledging that safety, acknowledging the psychological competition among the concept. Like Jake was alluding to, if somebody owns the space of safety, the brain doesn't allow two different things to occupy that space necessarily. It wants to gravitate to that single focus perception. But there's also associations. So if somebody owns safety, not only do they own, because of the way that we think, the brain doesn't understand safety as its own unique, isolated word. It understands what it is in the context of relationships, particularly similar concepts. So not only are you going to have a difficult time going after safety, but related concepts like defense, security, shelter, maybe even freedom. This is a thing that you need to think about because they're all actually competitive landscapes. And you could actually go out and survey people and try to get a sense for which concepts compete with each other and make sure that you're addressing this sort of thing in the work that you're doing. So
One place you can get some of this data is in social media. You can track how people talk about your category, about your brand, about some of your competitors, and see the language they're using. And that can help you inform the mental map of concepts that they're using to defend this area. And when we do that around safety in the auto space, we find that these terms do have some resonance. However, they don't apply equally to all categories. For instance, David pointed out the word freedom. If we were talking about motorcycles, freedom means something very different than it does in the auto space and wouldn't be competitive with safety, right, David?
Yeah, it's complicated, as we know. And in fact, this webinar is called Calculated Bets. It's called bets because we don't know with certainty what we're doing, but we are making calculated smart bets. So Jake talked about Nissan going down the road thinking they can steal safety and they run into a roadblock. We said, look, you actually have to be aware of these other terms too, because they psychologically compete with that concept. But maybe that means that you're going to go in the direction of innovative. And that means you got smooth sailing. Look at that, just calm open seas, no competitors. Life is so great. Except there's like probably sharks in the water because there's always some competitors out there. Let's be real.
And I can do a whole rant about the power of the word safety versus innovative and how it lacks action at the point of sale and people don't use it as a reason to buy, but it is unique. It is something that they can own. But it's also important to recognize that how we talk about something has a massive impact on the ability to own it. Great example in the carpet space. We were working with a carpet manufacturer who had a new product and they wanted to lean into stain resistance. And as we pointed out, just about everybody talked about stain resistance. The top 6 manufacturers all talked about stain resistance. Several competing products that weren't carpet themselves talked about stain resistance. And it was just a heavily trafficked space, forgive the pun. But we realized that there was a way that we could own it by doing something that changed how the brain stored this information. So you start with, what are the cliches in the space? What do we have to avoid? And the cliches you're all familiar with, the frustrated mom, the glass of spilled wine, the pet walking across the floor, or the kid crawling across the floor to remind you of the roll of carpet in your lives. Those don't move needles because we're so used to seeing them. They were the cliches. Instead, we decided to do something that was cognitively disruptive that had a high memory factor. And that was to do something out of the ordinary. So in this case, what we did is we took Mohawk's carpet called Smart Strand, and we did something radical with it. We went to several major zoos, including the Dallas Zoo and the Birmingham Zoo, and we carpeted the animal enclosure for several large animals, including rhinos, elephants, and giraffes. And then we turned those animals into social media stars. We did this both through social media and through a big public relations push. So already we're talking to different audiences, different vehicles, different mediums with a radically different message that broke all of the cliches within this space. At the end of the period, we did a cleaning demonstration where we cleaned the carpets that the animals had been living on just using water. We did it live, and the results were tremendous. Massive PR coverage throughout the campaign. Over 160 million people followed the campaign, which is one of the most successful campaigns in the country that year. We sold over 50 million yards of carpet during the 6-week period of the campaign. We had a 6-month backlog of orders, but perhaps what the most astounding piece of success out of this was how it changed long-term memory within the space. All of a sudden, no one else could claim stain resistance because it was such a demonstrable example of owning it. To this day, if you walk into a carpet store and you ask about Smart Strand, they're going to tell you the story about the time a rhino lived on this carpet and how it still came clean. That's a great example of using creative to help you own mental space and carve it out for yourself, even if you feel that it can be well worn in an existing space. Great creative example. So to recap, the things that we're going to encourage you to go through process-wise, step 1, we're going to reevaluate our market, look at macro trends, look at what's going on in our space and how we're going to take advantage of it. Step 2, we're going to set goals and be very specific about those goals. And we're going to map those against psychological drivers. Who are we talking to? What are they thinking? And what do we want them to think? Then we're going to identify where that growth or that savings is going to come from, whatever your goal is. We're going to be hyper specific about it. It's going to come from this segment in this way. And only then do we get to the creative portion of the exercise. We talk about how to communicate with them. Now, of course, you want to overlay psychology through all of these steps to make it particularly powerful. But if you do that, you can find that your 2021 can be more successful. You can take calculated bets, because I realize we still don't know all the answers of what 21 is going to look like. And that's what we're trying to accomplish. Place smarter bets than we would have otherwise. Now, we have covered a week's worth of material in just under an hour here, and I'm sure you've got other questions. I want to get to those. But before we do, I want to remind you that if you like this, a lot of other content on our website, all of our social media channels, you can find at /Intermarc Group, where we have regular psychology-driven content. This video will also be available on our website starting tomorrow. And weekly, we also put out something called the CMO Minute, where we take regular research and trends that are ongoing and we talk about their implications in the marketing space. Feel free to sign up for that newsletter. But let's take a few questions from the audience. If you have other questions that we can't get to today, feel free to email me directly. I would love to nerd out with you and talk about this some more. Ashley can help schedule some time. But I'm sure there were some good questions submitted. What do you got for us, Ashley?
Got a few. First question is segmentation the best way to map psychological drivers?
Great question. So short answer is yes. So you start with the segmentation. What are the different audiences that we can talk about? And then you overlay psychological drivers. We are blessed in that there are a number of third-party data sources that you can get. So you don't have to do your own research, because most people can't afford it. And then map those drivers, those behaviors, answers to other survey questions against that segment. Then you can breathe life into the segment, understand how they're feeling, what they're thinking, what they consider important, and we can map them against existing psychological profiles. So select your segment first, then breathe life into it psychologically, and then you can go through the process of selecting which one of those can I affect most easily, or where do I think my growth should come from. That's the point at which you begin making the selection process. So segments, psychology, goal setting.
We've got another question related to that, which is I don't have customer data. How do I do customer segmentation without traditional data?
Oh, good question. And this is a good budget question. And a lot of our clients, including some very, very large companies, don't have their own segmentation data. So segmentation data you can get from a lot of different sources. Of course, it is most powerful when you get it from your own data sets, your own customer list. We're looking at your own customers in social media and understanding what they're talking about, or doing our own research against those customers. But assuming we don't have that, you likely have trade groups that has done segmentation within your space that you can use as a starting point. There are third-party segmentation profiles that we can use, and we subscribe to most of those. So if you need help in doing a segmentation against your own group, chances are we have an off-the-shelf one that we at least have a starting space from. Then you can take that and map it against your customer segment to refine instead of starting from scratch. Clearly, it's not quite as good as using your own customer data, but very few companies are large enough with big enough budgets to do that themselves. So those are the places I would encourage you to start looking. Start with something that's already in existence and refine it against your segment. Now, it is important to note, don't just use it off the shelf, because they homogenize that data. As my example earlier, we homogenize accents. It sounds like everybody is from Ohio instead of the accents that we have down here in the Southeast. The same is true with segmentation. Your audience that lives in Alabama, that's going to be very different than that same segment that lives in Oregon. And they'll likely be different psychologically as well. So make sure you do some of your own work to refine those. But if you can't do that, then start with some segmentation, so at least you're making a smarter calculated bet.
Next question, how long should you test one of these strategic considerations before pivoting?
Great question. So the answer lies really fundamentally with budget, both in terms of how much you can wait to find out, but also your tracking tools. And tracking tools is perhaps the most important within that set, as well as what you're doing. If it's a very low funnel activity, you should be able to get data fairly quickly on its efficacy. So if we're buying keywords as an example, or we're doing some social media ads, we can track in near real time the outcome of those, unless it is a product that can't be purchased or interacted with online, or maybe a low research category, in which case we're going to have to wait a little while longer. So the answer is going to depend on the variables that you have that we can use to evaluate. So if you were selling tea that you've got to go to the store and buy, we may have to wait a month or two of a cycle to see the effect of an outcome. And that needs to be part of your plan. So that you're putting your plan in place, you need the testing piece in place so that you know what variables am I hoping to affect and how am I going to track those. A lot of our clients with robust budgets are tracking and evaluating once a quarter. If it's a very low funnel activity, high sales, we're tracking that often weekly or even more frequently. If it is harder to track, sometimes that curve can be even longer and might even be on an annualized basis. So it depends on what you sell, your budgets, your tracking ability, and your tolerance for waiting.
We have two more questions. So next one is, what do you predict for big bet marketing opportunities in 2021?
Great question. If you've seen some of these webinars, you've heard that the major takeaway from 2021 is behavior change. I mean, we're all undergoing massive change in how we process information, how we are shopping, and our willingness to try new brands, to establish new relationships. That is probably the #1 macro trend that people are discounting. They get giddy because people are buying more of their products, and they ignore the fact that lots of other people would if given a slight nudge. And they're also equally as blind to the risk that's sitting there in front of them. If people are willing to shop additional brands, that means some of your customers are willing to leave you for somebody else. So giving a little more attention to retention marketing is a risk that people are often ignoring. So that is the macro trend that's going to be huge. A lot of the other ones we can mention you're likely familiar with, the increase in digital shopping. If you're in the food space, how people are shopping for groceries has radically changed. That gives us a new intervention point. People, how they shop for food and make selections on restaurants has changed. And how we are shopping and planning for vacations is undergoing a major change as well. So everybody has major change. So some trends within your categories, you got to start there.
My last question, let's see. I'm planning my marketing budget for 2021. Do you have recommendations for how I should prioritize spending?
Whew. Not an easily quipable answer. It's really going to depend in going through this process. You got to start with what are your goals? Where do you think that growth is going to come from? And then budget begins to matter as the question. You map it against what some of the opportunity zones are. And you map that by asking the question, how feasible is it that this budget can affect this segment to help me achieve my goal? And sometimes you come to answers that are uncomfortable, like we don't have enough money to do the mass market strategy. And that was frankly in the Mohawk example with the carpet, how we came to the outcome of we didn't have enough money for a TV strategy or traditional marketing strategy. We had to create big news and to take a shot down the field. Thus, budget comes in at that second step of the planning process. And if you put it in there, things become a little more obvious. Well, guys, we are bumping up against time. I want to say thank you for your willingness to come and listen. I hope some of this has been informative, and I hope some of you have additional questions that you want to talk with after the fact, because clearly David and I love talking about this. We will start again in another week with our next CMO Minute, so go to our website and sign up for that, and we will talk with everybody again soon. Thank you so much.